Okay, I'm glad everyone is here. We're going to get started. I want to just welcome our guest, Emily Loeb. She is our guest speaker today. Let's give her a round of applause. Welcome. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to ask that you guys please turn on your camera and try to turn off your mic. Make sure your microphone is off until you ask a question. We're going to have some time for some questions. It's going to be in the second half of the presentation. And I've assigned everybody some questions, so we'll go in like an order, and they're in the dialogue box now. If you want to take a look at them, you can see them, and we'll have some time to do that. And if we have time after that, we'll get to the questions that we had thought of also ahead of time. Please speak loudly and clearly. And I really just want to thank you for being here. It's really, we have a great opportunity here to speak with Emily. And I am going to hide my presentation and turn it over to Emily.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I know that you guys are going to be asking me some questions about my grandparents' lives, but I thought I would present the story that I usually share through the Holocaust Center. So you can get a sense of who my grandparents were before you ask some questions, because I think it might help with some context. So I'm going to pull up my presentation, and feel free to ask me questions if you have any questions in the middle of it. Please feel free to ask. So I'm going to be telling you a little bit about my grandmother, whose name was Ilse Dahl Cole, and she survived the Holocaust. And this is my grandmother, and she came to America in 1938. And my grandfather also immigrated with her in 1938 as well. So my grandmother used to present her story of surviving the Holocaust to an organization that was similar to the Holocaust Center here in Pittsburgh, called the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. And she would talk to high school students just like you guys and share her story as a way to try to promote peace and tolerance around the world. So in 2018, I got to go visit where my grandparents were from in Germany. And my grandmother was from a little town called Geilenkirchen, which is pictured in the top right corner. And it was a small farming community of about 4,000 people when she lived there. My grandfather was from a city called Koblenz, which is pictured in the bottom center photo. And similar to Pittsburgh, Koblenz is located at the confluence of two rivers. Actually, you can see the rivers coming together. They were different temperatures and one had a little more mud in one of the photos. And they came together to form the Rhine River, which is very famous for wine. They have tons of vineyards up and down the river and really ancient castles. And then my grandmother lived for a short time in a city called Aachen, which is located about 20 kilometers from Geilenkirchen. And it is where Charlemagne lived. He was a famous leader in Europe centuries and centuries ago. And you can see that in Aachen, there's this mixture of architecture dating back from Charlemagne. In the back, there's that old castle, to like steel and glass modern buildings that are in the foreground. So I should note that, I'm not a historian. I tell the story that I got from my grandmother and from people who have shared information with us about our family history in Geilenkirchen. And while my grandfather immigrated from Germany, I mainly have information about my grandmother's family. So that's really who I speak the most about. So as I mentioned, my grandparents were both from Northwest Germany. The red dot in the map there, on the map there, is where my grandmother was from, which was right near the Dutch border. And she was born May 8th, 1916. And this is the house where my grandmother was born. It was her grandparents' home in a small town called Hamm. And when my great grandfather Emil was serving during the World War I Army for Germany, my great grandmother Clara went back to her family's house to give birth to her second child, which was my grandmother Ilse. And the picture on the left, there's like two little girls. You can barely see them, but there's two little girls playing in the front yard. And that is my grandmother and her older sister, Hilda. And the photo on the right is how the house looks today. It is now a community center. It was taken away from our family, and now it still stands, but it serves as a community center for the city. So when my great grandfather Emil returned from the army, or returned from the war, from World War I, my great grandmother Clara, my grandmother Ilsa, and her older sister Hilda moved back to Geilenkirchen. And as I mentioned, this was a small farming community of about 4,000 people. And this is a photo of how the town looked when my grandmother lived there. And my grandmother and my grandfather was, or my grandmother and her family, they were deeply rooted in Germany. They loved Germany. My great grandfather, as I mentioned, he was a veteran, and they were people who thought of themselves as German who happened to be Jewish, just like I think of myself as an American who happens to be Jewish. And some of you may be Jewish or Christian or atheist or Muslim, or they considered themselves German. And this photo is another angle of the town. It's what it looked like in the early 1900s. And one of the things that I learned when I was there is that my family lived in this town for over 220 years before World War II happened. And I didn't really realize that. I mean, my grandmother growing up, she had always told me that everyone in our family had always lived in Geilenkirchen before she moved away. But until I went and visited, I didn't really get that. But when I went to Geilenkirchen, I discovered that this house that you see pictured here was built by my great 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 grandfather. This home had been in our family for generations, and it was built in 1850. And you can see different pictures of it through over the years. And the driveway that's on the right hand side used to serve as a passageway that my ancestor used to walk his cattle down and graze in the field that was behind the home. And my family, it turns out, was a family of cattle merchants. And so everyone in our family dealt with cattle and livestock. So just down the street from Elias Dahl's house was the house that my great grandfather Emil grew up in, and so did my grandmother Ilsa. You can see there's an arrow pointing to it. So I show these pictures to show you that my family was deeply rooted in this community. It turns out that we had over 10 generations of family living in this town before the 1930s. And as you can see in Emil and Clara Dahl's home, it's part of like almost like a row house. This community was integrated. There was no separation of Jews in one section and Christians in another. They were a small community that lived and worked together. So there's a Jewish cemetery in Geilenkirchen. And when I went there, what I discovered was my family name on tombstone after tombstone after tombstone. And I, seeing that is what really reiterated that, wow, this is where my ancestors had lived. So, whoops. My grandmother used to tell me lots of stories of what it was like growing up in Geilenkirchen, and she had a very happy, normal childhood. She and her older sister Hilda and her younger brother Erich did everything that normal teenagers and children would do. You know, they played sports, they had friends, they would ride their bikes to Holland. There was a castle in the community that the family that owned this castle would let people from Geilenkirchen come and ice skate on the moat. And you can see at the bottom left is a photo of my grandmother in probably the late 1920s or early 1930s standing there. And so they would outside this castle, and I was able to go visit it. It still is there and used today by the community. My grandmother's family was quite large. So this is a photo of my grandmother's 75th birthday. So my great 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 grandmother is pictured there sitting in the middle, surrounded by this huge extended family. And this family would get together for holidays and birthdays and celebrations. My grandmother also attended a Catholic high school, which always gets a lot of surprise, but it was the best high school in her little town, and it still exists today. It's called St. Ursula's. And she was allowed to attend it and wasn't differentiated in any way, except that she did not have to attend religious classes. And this is a picture of my grandmother at the top left of the photo with her classmates. And the children who were Lutheran also didn't have to go to religious classes. And my grandmother had lots of friends. She was a very accomplished athlete. After high school, she ran and competed in track and field events. She used to tell me that she was training to be in the Olympics before the rise of Nazi Germany. And, what I'm hoping you can see through these photos is that she had, what seemed like a completely normal childhood. And she graduated valedictorian of her class in 1932 when she was 16 years old. So I'm not going to share this video with you, but my grandmother would talk about that experience of what it was like growing up in a community where you thought you were the same as everyone else until all of a sudden you realized that they didn't think that you were the same as them. And she tells a story about coming home one day and one of her childhood friends, I mean, this is a town of 4,000 people, and there was a boy that lived in her community who was placed by the Nazis to stand guard outside of her home to make sure that non-Jews would not enter their home. And she came home and or saw him standing outside of her doorway and said hello to him, right? They grew up in the same community together. And he pretended that he had never met her. And she says that that was the first time that she realized that things had changed, that if people, everyday people and friends and community members were all of a sudden isolating her and making her feel like an other and different and not part of the community, that there was something really going on in Germany. So these photos show my great grandfather on the left. He's the one that's in the picture on the left. He's the one that's bald, standing with his family, or a brother of his, in Germany. And then the photo on the right is my grandfather's family. They were celebrating the 25th anniversary of their family shoe store. They owned a big shoe store in downtown Koblenz, and they had over 50 employees. And when you look in newspapers from Koblenz in the early 1930s and late 1920s, there were photos of their business having like floats and things in the parades and participating in a ton of community events. My great grandfather, who I mentioned before, he served in the German army for World War I. And two of my grandmother's uncles were actually killed in battle during World War I. And I mention this because it's important to understand the timeline of how this happened. World War I was in the 19 teens and World War II happened 20 years later. So here you had people that were veterans, military veterans, who went from being war heroes to then being told that they were no longer welcome members of an entire country. The photo here on the left is of the little boy is my grandfather, Walter, when his dad Siegfried returned from the war. And you can see Siegfried, their last name was Kohn when they lived in Germany. That was our family name, and my grandfather later changed it when he came to America. So as I think you'll learn in history in your class, there was a change in politics which changed my family's life. So in 1932, the National Socialists won the greatest share of the popular vote of the election. They didn't win more than 50%. They just won the most out of all of the people that were running. And so that put them in charge of the government. And then they appointed Adolf Hitler as their chancellor. And that changed the course of Germany and the course of my family's life forever. And they believed that they were superior to other people, or rather that other groups were inferior to them. And that was not just Jews. It included homosexuals, Blacks, gypsies. There were groups of people they felt were not worthy of being German. And this sign, which says, "He who buys at a Jewish shop is a traitor against the people," was located in the downtown area of Geilenkirchen. In fact, my grandmother, who's the red dot in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, is where my grandmother lived. And then the green path is the path that she walked to school. And so every day she passed by that red bar, which was that sign, to and from school, and had to read that. And so you think about what those messages would do day after day, year after year, of you seeing that people felt that you were not a valuable member of this society. And the impact that the Nazis had on my family was immediate. They started telling the community through media messages and propaganda that Jews were untrustworthy. They depicted them as animals. They made laws saying that Jews couldn't do certain things like get their hair cut in a barber shop or buy meat at a butcher shop or have phone lines. And eventually they started stripping Jews of their voting rights. And they essentially also affected my grandfather's business. They had a Nazi spy that worked for my grandfather who would report the financial dealings to the government. And they made life really, really uncomfortable for Jews. Initially, people said that they were just looking to make life so uncomfortable for the Jews that they would move away. And many did. Many moved to France or to Holland to get out of Germany. So, as I mentioned, I got to go to Germany in 2018. The woman who I'm sitting there with, her name is Elizabeth, and she was a child that grew up in Geilenkirchen during the 1930s. And she told me that her teachers would share the Nazi propaganda. They would teach the Nazi propaganda to the kids. And then soldiers would come by their house and ask her parents, "What are you doing to support the Nazis?" And, she said that her parents weren't Nazis. In fact, her mom worked for one of my relatives, but they also felt compelled to sort of comply in some way so they wouldn't get in trouble. And so her mother mended Nazi uniforms. And, it's hard because a lot of people after the war said, "Oh, I was never a Nazi and we never supported them." And we'll never know, what the truth is there. But what we do know is that there was a lot of pressure that the Nazi government put on people to not fight back, to not say things, to not stand up for others. And you saw this because like the White Rose Society, which was a group of non-Jewish college kids who tried to stand up to the Nazi government, they were killed. My great uncle, who got beaten up at school all the time, a priest tried to advocate on his behalf to be able to stay in school once the Nazis wouldn't let Jews be in high school, and that priest disappeared. And so you don't know whether the propaganda worked with time and people became convinced that, yeah, let's get rid of Jews out of Germany because it'll be better for the country, or whether they were silenced by fear. So these are some of the things that you would see around Germany of the defacing of Jewish businesses that happen. And these are some other photos of my grandmother. She was, as I said, she was an athlete and she did national competitions in sports. So one of the things that started happening was that there were whisperings about what the Nazis were doing, and no one really knew what the eventual goal was. And my grandparents, Ilsa and Walter, both tried to live as normal of a life as possible. And so my grandmother finished high school in 1932, and then she moved to Berlin first she moved to Aachen to become a dressmaker. She had always dreamed of becoming an archaeologist, but because of the Nazi laws, which didn't allow Jews to go to college anymore, she ended up deciding to become a dressmaker. So she first secured an apprenticeship in Aachen with a dressmaker, and then she got admitted into a Jewish-only design school in Berlin. And then that school was shut down, and so she decided to try to find a job, and she secured a job as a dressmaker. And my grandparents are pictured there in the middle. And so while their life was different, they tried to live the best normal life that they could under the circumstances. And so one day my grandfather had a good friend who, like I was saying, there were all these whisperings about what the Nazis were really wanting to do with the Jews. His friend went to a Nazi meeting to sort of hear for himself what was going to happen. And after the meeting, he came and he found my grandfather and he said, Walter, if what the Nazis are saying is true, they're not looking to just make life uncomfortable for Jews in Germany. They're going to kill you. And he said, you need to leave. You need to save yourself because they are looking to exterminate the Jews. And he said, if you call out my name tomorrow, I will not answer you. I will pretend I've never met you. And my grandfather, these words, like when I first heard this, the word sounds so harsh, but really that man saved my grandparents' lives, because had my grandfather came home that night and told my grandmother what his friend had said, and my grandmother immediately started preparing to leave. And so they started contacting relatives in America and in England to try to get sponsorships for coming to America, which means that a sponsorship letter essentially means that if you can't take care of yourself financially, this person will help provide for you so that you don't become a burden on the state, is sort of how they viewed it. And so my grandmother contacted relatives in St. Louis, and my grandfather contacted his uncle in England and also an uncle in Kansas, and they secured sponsorship. So one of the things that unfortunately happened is that my great grandparents didn't think that it was going to be that bad for them. They did not think that they would end up well, I guess, how do I say this? No one knew exactly what the Nazis were going to do until they were doing it. And my grandmother used to say that her parents didn't get out of Germany because they couldn't see what was coming. And one of the things that ended up happening was that the man pictured on the far right was a German refugee living in Poland, and he murdered the man who's on the left, who is a German diplomat living in, this happened in Paris. And when that happened, the Nazis made it clear on the radio that all non-Jewish Germans were supposed to blame Jews for what happened. And so that night became known as Kristallnacht. And my grandmother had decided to go home in November of 1938 to visit her parents for the last couple of weeks that she would have in Germany. And while they were there, they heard Nazi soldiers who were making a lot of commotion. Oops, I need to hurry up. And I'm so sorry, David. So the Germans said, "Are you Jewish?" And my great grandfather said, "Yes." And they said, "We're going to burn your house down." And so they ended up not burning the house down, but my grandmother sort of left in haste and left Germany. And her parents ended up in Aachen visiting family because they didn't know what was going on. And what ended up happening is that all of the German or Jewish synagogues, community centers were in shambles. They were burned down by soldiers. This is the Geilenkirchen synagogue after Kristallnacht in 1938. And so that was when my grandparents left Germany. And like I said, neither of their parents got out in time, and they were all killed along with my grandfather's sister in concentration camps. And so I will, with the matter of time, end that. So that gives you some background. of my family, and we can go into questions. Is that good? I sort of abruptly stopped, but I realized
Yeah.
the time.
No, thank you. That was an amazing story. Wow. I feel like you can make a Hollywood film out of that. It's really powerful. So, class, we have some questions that we are going to be asking, and if you can please take a look in the dialogue box, I have assigned everybody a question, and I'll sort of, get you guys started with them. And if you could quickly take a look there just to see what your question is and where we are in the order of things. So, why don't we start with Tyler? Tyler, could you ask the first question in the dialogue box next to your name?
What was your family's life like before it was interrupted by the war and the Shoah?
The Shoah. So both of my grandparents' family lives, which I touched on a little bit, were very normal childhoods, right? So like I said, my grandmother was an athlete and a scholar, and she had lots of friends. They lived in this small town where lots of their cousins lived, and my grandmother went to, like I said, a Catholic high school, and they had a lot of family that were in the cattle business, but also my great uncle was training to become a chef. So my my grandmother's family was sort of, I think, like a middle class, business owner family. My grandfather's family, on the other hand, was a very wealthy family from Koblenz, because they owned this big shoe store. And they were sort of prominent civic leaders. And according to my uncle, they had a country house outside of Koblenz. And my grandfather, I don't know, I feel like I read somewhere that he was planning on becoming a doctor at one point. He ended up, when he immigrated to America, going into the flooring business. He apprenticed under someone and ended up opening like a carpet business. But so my grandparents' lives in Germany were really normal lives. Like I said, they did not think of themselves as different from their fellow citizens. And in a lot of ways, they were really comfortable. So you can imagine that uprooting of, you hear about immigrants a lot, and when you imagine what it is that people leave, like if someone flees their country, when I think about my grandparents, I think about what it must have taken for them to want to leave their lives, right? Their families, their communities that they had lived in and had wonderful, comfortable, kind of easy lives, until all of a sudden it wasn't.
Great. Thank you for that response. Yara, I'm not sure if you can see, I'm just going to put a new question for you in the box if you can't see the original one. But Yara, could you ask the next question, please?
Hi. So the question is, did your parent, grandparent, etc., share with you what they were like when they were a teenager?
Yeah, they did, especially my grandmother. My grandmother loved her childhood, and she talked about it a lot with me. She would tell me about how I had mentioned that she was training. She told me she was training to go to be in the Olympics, and she was a intense athlete and competitor and scholar, and she loved her childhood. I mean, she has really happy memories of what it was like growing up in Geilenkirchen and being there. And so one of the things that's kind of interesting about my grandparents is, because they got visas to leave before, like they were never in concentration camps, they were able to pack up crates and boxes and ship them to America. So part of the reason I have photos is because they brought photo albums and they brought things with them from Germany. And so my grandmother, when I was little, used to pull out her photo albums and show me pictures of what her life was like in Germany before the war. And she used to say that she didn't know what happened. It was like the whole country went crazy. And I thought that feeling of just the world being completely flipped upside down is it's hard to grasp until you see how quickly sort of messaging and politics can change a whole community or a whole country. And so she would often kind of contrast that of what her childhood had been like. They used to go to the beach and they would go on vacations, and she and her older sister used to ride their bikes to Holland and stuff. I mean, it just sounds like how kids would live when you imagine kids living out in the country and sort of farming community. And so, yeah, I was really lucky that she would talk to me about her childhood, because there are a lot of survivors who don't, that there's either it's too painful for them to remember what life was like before the war, or they don't want their children or grandchildren to sort of be scared about what could happen, or they just are sort of forward looking, right? They're like, we're not going to talk about what happened in the past at all. And so I feel really lucky that, one, I lived close to my grandparents, so I had a really close relationship with them, but also they wanted to tell us about what their childhood was like.
Thank you for that response. AJ, could you ask the next question? And I'm going to just hit enter so you can see it if you can look back into the chat.
How do you think the war changed your family, like your parents and your grandparents and others?
So it profoundly changed everything about our family. I mean, I think my grandparents potentially would have still met and married because there were sort of some connections between them. They lived in the same region. But in regard to their lives, it was profound. I mean, my grandfather's family lost their family business. The government confiscated the property where the shoe store was, and my grandparents went back in like the 1960s to try to reclaim it. And the government told them that it was like in rubble. And the government said, well, you can clear all the rubble from, because, should back up, the US military and the Allies bombed Koblenz. And so many of the old structures in the downtown were completely decimated. So the German government told my family that they could pay to have the rubble removed, and then they could have the property back. But if they couldn't afford it, then they would have to turn the property back over to the government, who would take care of it. So they lost that. They lost their family home. They lost their country home. My grandparents, my grandmother's family, Emil and Clara, ended up losing their family business, the cattle business. My great grandmother ended up opening up like a little library, almost like a little bookstore out of the house at first to try to make ends meet. They eventually had to sell their property, undervalued the house that had been in our family for generations. And they moved to Aachen and moved in with my great-grandfather's brother's family, which is where they were deported from to concentration camps. So my grandmother tried to get reparations for her and my grandfather, which means that for the rest of their lives after the war, they would have gotten money from the government to almost as like a payment for what they did to us. But my grandparents submitted the papers too late in their little time period that they had set up, so they didn't get that. I mean, there was a lot that dramatically changed my grandparents' lives. And then so that was sort of like financial and tangible things that were taken. But then there was also the emotional piece. And, my people used to kind of laugh and say, oh, my grandmother is like a glass is half empty kind of person. And when you think about your entire extended family being murdered and your parents being murdered and you trying to get them out and not doing that successfully and living with that guilt and trying to raise a family in America and not have them be afraid of being Jewish and having them be positive and stuff, and moving to America. She barely spoke English. She and my grandfather had $18 to their names when they came off the boat in America in 1938. And I kind of think, I don't even know how she got up every day, like to put one foot in front of the other and have a really positive attitude can be really hard. And so I give her a lot of credit because she and my grandfather built and had an amazing life in America, but they also lived with a lot of personal trauma that they had to get over. And, I don't know if she went to therapy. I don't know how emotionally you get through that, but I know she lived with guilt forever that she wasn't able to save her parents or my grandfather's parents or my grandfather's younger sister.
Wow, that is real powerful. Lainey, if you could ask the next question, I'm also going to put it in the chat box if you missed it earlier.
What do you think your family's life would have been like had it not been interrupted by the war? What about your own life?
So my own life, I guess I probably wouldn't be here because my dad's family was like a fourth generation Kansas City family. So they had been there from the 1800s. But my mom probably still would have been born in Germany. And what my parents and my grandparents' life would be like, I can't even, it's almost hard to imagine, right? Would my grandmother have been able to become an archaeologist? Would my grandfather had taken over his family business and been a businessman in Germany? And, with the changes that we saw from the 1930s all the way up until the 90s and 2000s when my grandparents were still alive, would those businesses have become franchises? I mean, it's almost impossible to know kind of what could have been. Considering the fact that my grandparents came to America and maintained relationships with extended family members that did make it out, I imagine that there would have been a lot of family gatherings and celebrations. And one of the things that was surprising to me when I went to Germany is I met people who were my cousins, like third, fourth, fifth cousins that I didn't even know existed because my mom's family was always so small. Like we would get together for holidays with third or fourth cousins because we didn't have a big family. Like my mom did not have grandparents, which I always think like that's such a, she didn't have grandparents. She had two first cousins that lived in St. Louis, and she had two first cousins that lived in England. And my grandfather and they had no other cousins on my grandfather's side because no one else got out. And so to think about being part of a large family, that this huge extended family is almost mind-boggling, because my great grandfather Emil was one of 10 children. And so when we look at family trees, there's this guy in Geilenkirchen who does all this genealogical research for us. And when I was there, he spread out our family tree, and it like went all the way across his dining room table and spilled onto the floor. And when you think like, I know my fourth cousins because that was sort of, we had one or two cousins here or there, to see, hundreds of people that we were related to was sort of mind-boggling. And so I imagine that, our family our life in Germany would have been completely different because it would have been a continuation of being German and being part of that community. I often say, so my husband's family is Native American, and, they talk about being on the Trail of Tears, and you think back, like that part of their family went back generations in America. And it's a weird thing to think about that my family went generations and like dozens of generations back in Germany. And when you are a grandchild of an immigrant, you don't really think like, oh, there's a place that was our family's place. But that's what Germany was for my family.
All right, I think we have time for maybe 2 questions. So Quahim, could you ask the next one? I put it in the chat box.
It didn't fully send, but I do have a question.
Okay.
How do you think that affect their like religion? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. So my grandmother grew up both my grandparents, I think, grew up in very strict households. Like my great grandparents kept kosher, and They went to synagogue. There in Germany, there wasn't like Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. And when my grandparents came to America, they joined a Reform synagogue. But they were the most religious sort of Reform people I knew. They went to synagogue every week. And I think probably had they had a different perspective, they probably would have joined a conservative synagogue. But they didn't like lose faith in their religion, and they didn't want, like I think I said this earlier, they did not want my mom and her siblings growing up afraid of being Jewish. And so it became an important, it always was an important part of their life. And I think they always felt like there was this thing that people saw as different about them, and it's just who we were and what our religion was. But they were also, like, my entire family is very involved in social justice issues, partially as a result of this personal experience that you know what it feels like to be persecuted, and therefore it's our responsibility to make sure that everyone is treated equally, because you can't help what family you're born into or what color you are or what race you are, what ethnicity you are. And so therefore we have a responsibility of treating everyone equally.
Okay, I think we only have time for one more question. And I wanted to let everybody here know that it's traditional in Judaism that we light a candle in memory, in memorial for people. And I wanted to know if Emily had a candle.
I do.
Awesome. And Krista has a question for you.
Okay.
So is there anybody for whom you light the candle? And if so, are you comfortable telling us a little bit about that person?
Yeah, I mean, I'm lighting the candle in honor of my grandparents, who you guys have heard about. I think both of them were incredibly strong. I don't know. I think the idea of leaving your home because you don't feel safe is an incredibly scary thought, of leaving everything you know and love and your native language. I mean, all of that. I don't know how they had the foresight and also the strength to do that. And while no one should have to leave their home to flee persecution, I always think about my grandparents when I hear about immigrants or refugees, because I think I always thought of my grandparents as people that were immigrants to America, but until I really started realizing they were actually refugees, it puts their experience in a whole different light. And so I really try to remember their struggle and their desire to do live their best life despite horrible circumstances, and also do well by other people by sharing this story, which is what I can't believe my grandmother told the story over and over and over again to high school students just like you, and how painful that would be, but how she told me she always hoped that she would live to see world peace. And I think that's part of the reason that she sort of went through that pain of retelling her story, to try to educate young people about how important it is to treat everyone equally and to stand up when you see something that's wrong.
Emily, thank you so much for
You're
being here
welcome.
today. Guys, can we give a round of applause, please? This was so powerful, and we'll be able to use this as a way to think about the Holocaust and the things we're going to learn about moving forward.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad, and I'm happy anytime to come and speak and give the full presentation. I think I underestimate how long I actually talk for during it.
You did great, and thank you. And class, thank you for being so respectful, and
Yeah,
I
thank
appreciate
you.
you helping out with the questions. I will see you guys next week. Have a great break.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
You're welcome. Thanks.
See ya.
Have a nice week, you too. It was nice meeting you, Miss Emily.
Thank you very much. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.